Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for this online workshop, Best Practices for Documenting Social Sciences Research Data. My name is Maureen Haker. I've worked with the archive for over 10 years now on everything from ingesting new collections to reusing some of our data in reuse projects. So today I'm here with Emma, who's going to be helping us out, kind of sending through some worksheets at different times and that sort of thing. Um, but without further ado, I think it is time now. We can go ahead and get started. I'm going to be doing a fair bit of talking, but there are some exercises that are scattered throughout the workshop to try and make it a little bit more interactive. If there are moments where I'm able to check in on the Q&A, I will do that and try and pop some answers in there. But if not, we should have some time at the end where I can go through some frequently asked questions. This is an introductory workshop, so we're assuming that you may have had some research methods training, but we're really aiming to help build a foundation of knowledge about, research data, collecting research materials, and sharing research data. There's quite a lot of what I think could be new vocabulary for some of you within this workshop. So just kind of be advised, it is meant to be a more introductory workshop to documentation. Okay, so this is a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be doing today. We'll start with the basics. What is documentation? Why is it important? Including some discussion on FAIR principles. From there, we're going to move to metadata. So this is data about data, which is really what documentation is at its core. We'll then move on to some examples of data level documentation, then study level documentation, with a distinction between some of the common documentation for qualitative projects and documentation for quantitative projects. And then throughout, again, there's some exercises to give you a bit of an opportunity to look at some examples and think a little bit more about the kind of documentation you can and should include with your project. So before we get started with content, though, I did want to do a quick activity which I hope will get you thinking about the importance of documentation. So Emma's going to send through a worksheet in the chat. I will swap my screen over in just a second, but on that worksheet, you'll find an interview extract. And you'll notice several things about this interview extract when you start reading it. But I would like you to try and guess, what is the participant's age and what year do you think the interview was conducted? So I know this is just a short excerpt for purposes of trying to include this as an exercise, but to the best of your ability, if you had to take a wild guess at the participant's age and the year the interview was done, what would you guess? So Emma should pop that through in the chat in just a moment if she hasn't already. And I'm going to swap my screen over so that you can see it on the screen as well. So it is a little bit of a dense reading. So I am going to give you like 7 or 8. I'll give you 8 minutes or so to try and get to grips with it. It's only about a page and a half long, but it is a little bit more difficult to read. So, and you'll see why in just a moment. So let me swap my screen. Okay, hopefully you guys have been able to have a go at having a read through this. If you can pop into the chat, we'll start with what age you think the participant is. This G19, how old, grandmother 19, how old do you think the interviewee is? So feel free to write your answer into the chat and we'll see what ages we come up with. Over 70, over 80, 75 plus, using the ONS category of 75 plus, 68, 60s to 80s. So I think we're all kind of coming in the upper bracket there. And a perhaps even harder question now would be, what year do you think this interview was conducted? 1970s, 2000, so a little bit of a range here. 1980s, 1990. Excellent. Okay, well, we do have the answers for you. So once again, Emma's going to pop another link into the chat, which will give you the answers to these. And I'm going to swap my sheet around as well on the screen, if you give me a moment to reshare. Here we are. So we have a grandmother aged 43. And there were a few people who I think had said the 70s for this interview. So late 70s, 1978 is when the interview was conducted. Um, so why do this exercise? I think it's an interesting exercise to do, not least because I think some of the guesses that we have about information behind the data reveals a lot more about ourselves than perhaps it does about the data itself. So I would have absolutely been with most of the rest of you in thinking grandmother. I mean, that's what it says right there, grandmother 19. Well, my memory of my grandmother is when she was older, so definitely over 60s, but even 70s, 80s. So I probably would have thought of that. But this particular research was done in Glasgow. Some of you might have noticed that this is a very kind of phonetic spelling of the interview. Um, and it's a very thick Scottish accent that's being phonetically spelled out. But it's with a family that the mothers were very, very young. So the grandmother is now very, very young as well at age 43. Um, so, I mean, this exercise, I think, helps show what the importance of documentation is, that we need to know certain things about the data in order to not assume misnomers about the data, in order to not get the wrong impression. I think it perhaps does potentially having this kind of data, this documentation with it. So this is kind of a mix of study level documentation and data level documentation. Having this, though, I think changes the way we view the data itself, and it's always very helpful. So bear with me again while I switch back to my slides. There we are. Okay, so from here then, I think we can start this discussion about documentation. So I just want to go back briefly to the types of documentation that we're covering, because I said we had both study level and data level documentation within the exercise worksheet that you saw. So what are these terms? What do they mean? So these are terms that are used by the UK Data Archive. Data level documentation provides a little bit more information about data objects. So this could be variable information in a data file, or some demographic details about the participant in an interview transcript. So there it was when the interview was conducted and the age of the interview. Interviewee. So that is examples of data level documentation. Study level documentation, however, is information about the broader research project. So what the methods are that were used, what a summaries of findings might be, that sort of thing. So there was kind of some intermix there. If you had scrolled down in the documentation, you would have seen a little bit more about the methodology as well. So that's a little bit more along the lines of a study level documentation. These aren't the only terms that can be used to describe that kind of information that sits alongside the data and helps reveal something about the data. All of this material that is created from your research is called different things by different policies. So archives like the UK Data Service will call it documentation. And under documentation, we have those specific kinds of documentation. So you can have items like user guides and data lists and data dictionaries, all of which we're going to talk about in this workshop. There's also things like README files, which you may have been asked to write for us if you've ever deposited data with us. Some policies, like the ESRC's data policy, refer to quote unquote research materials, which doesn't really have a specific definition as such, but rather it refers to anything that might have been used across the research project. It also refers to data assets, which are the system that's used to hold the data. And there's also metadata, and that's the specific, includes specific brand name, if you like, metadata like DDI. So DDI is a specific schema of metadata, which gives you a distinct vocabulary to use when describing the data. We will go through metadata in a little bit more detail. So while the concept of documentation is simple, the deeper you go, the deeper some of those ideas can run. So if you're interested in exploring a little bit more about the terminology, CoData has a working group dedicated to terminology and guidance on terminology. And hopefully the practical examples we have here today of the different types of documentation will give you enough of a flavor to really kind of dive into any area that you want to know a little bit more about. So now you know what documentation is on a basic level and the different levels of it, and are hopefully starting to see how embedded these, are to doing your research. But why do we have it? Why do we collect it? Documentation, from the point of the archive, maximizes the reuse value of the data, and it's also essential for us to review and publish data. So you can't understand data without that documentation. If you just dropped an interview transcript in the middle of the street and someone picked it up, they can't really understand the data without understanding the context in which it was gathered. And this adds to the historical value of the data, and it builds a provenance for it. Documentation allows you to expand on the methods and the processes that might not normally get covered in a publication. So there's endless space in documentation if you feel that it's useful for understanding the data. And doing so also helps enhance your research outputs. So documentation is an output in and of itself, and the documentation itself can also be reused. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. And it also adds levels of transparency to the research. So as part of the peer review process, reviewers can better understand the work in the data, and reusers can also more accurately and efficiently reuse that data. And finally, it aids the creation of fair research. So I'll talk more about fair data in just a moment. But first, I want to do a quick exercise which may highlight for some of you some of these points on why documentation is important. So let's just imagine for a moment you're looking at the table here. Can you understand what the data represents? We might be able to guess at the meaning, but we need a little bit more information to help us understand and use this data appropriately. So by adding some additional metadata, the data table is suddenly transformed and the usability has dramatically increased. However, we're still missing some important pieces of contextual information. So what other information would help make sense of this? Well, if we start applying additional metadata, this provides further information about the units in which the numerical data are presented, and it makes the data even easier to interpret. Okay, so hopefully this is a clear demonstration of how context can matter in both qualitative and quantitative contexts, and it can also change your perception of the data. But why share the documentation and data? And this particular point is one of the key underpinning principles to FAIR data. So FAIR principles are relatively new guidelines or goals of research which aim to make research more transparent, more collaborative, and more constructive. Since the early 2000s, technology has had a massive impact on how research is done. So we collect more data, which is more complex, and we share it much quicker than we've ever been able to do it before. However, despite collecting so much data all the time, we still have challenges to processing that data. So just think about any organization where data is not shared between departments and you have to constantly re-enter the same information. So how do we solve this? Well, in 2016, Wilkinson et al. Published the FAIR principles, which outlined what good data management looked like that would enable that kind of sharing and reuse of the data. The key here is to make the data machine readable. So this is, using the technology that we have that's massively changed the way we do research in a more effective way. Just make the data a little bit more machine readable so that we can use computers basically to do something with this mass amounts of data. And these guidelines were so influential that an international collaboration established the Go Fair International Support and Coordination Office just a year later. These FAIR principles continue to influence policies, so you'll see FAIR references in the data policies of the Research Data Alliance, of the Association of European Research Libraries, of the UKRI, who are, if you're based in the UK, and all of its research councils as well. So if you've ever received grants or taxpayer money to complete research, the chances are you will have been asked to share the data and documentation at the completion of the project. Many publishers now are also requiring the sharing of data and research materials before publication in the name of transparency and research rigor. So at the very least, they'll ask you to share it with the reviewers, if not actually have a clearly kind of accessible DOI in order to access that data and documentation. Okay, so the FAIR principles, I won't go through and read each of these, but the FAIR principles basically state that the data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Research is not just something that you complete in the solitude of an academic office. It's something which is completed in collaboration with others, and then it is shared for further reuse. To make your data fair, however, this also means documenting your data. And to make data findable and accessible requires clear metadata. And equally, to make the data reusable means documenting the provenance of that data. So again, I'm not going to go into each of the FAIR principles here in detail, but please do send in any questions that you might have about the FAIR principles into the Q&A. I'm happy to try and give a little bit more detail if you're interested in it. However, I did want to point out one thing about these FAIR principles, and it's something that spans across each of these 4 principles. And that is metadata. So metadata is really the root of what is documentation. It helps describe the data in catalog pages, if you're using the archive. It helps describe participants. It helps describe the methods. So there's a lot of grassroots work to build up what we call schemas of metadata to try and synchronize some of those descriptions. So we're going to expand a little bit more on metadata, and I will introduce you to DDI. So metadata, we'll cover what it is, what qualifies as good metadata, and what some of the standards are and how it's produced. So we're starting here with metadata because all documentation, in a sense, is metadata. But what is metadata? So the best definition that I've ever heard is that it is data about data. Essentially, it is information that describes and explains data. Usually when we talk about metadata, though, we're usually talking about a standardized and structured bit of information about data. So the idea behind this standardization is that, again, it's going to be machine readable. So if you go to our data catalog and you start searching through the data that we hold, our catalog is reading standardized metadata on the catalog pages to help bring back results. Because metadata is what is underpinning the cataloging, the citing, the discovering, and the retrieving of those data collections. Basically, you need metadata in order to be able to find data collections. So good, complete metadata becomes very important for the reuse of data. Importantly, metadata should be collected and recorded throughout the research data lifecycle. So it's not just simply something that you think about when you're depositing a data set or when you're looking at reusing data. Instead, you should be thinking of it, at each step. So creating, preserving, reusing the data, thinking through what kind of metadata is available at that point and what metadata might later enhance that collection. But what does metadata actually depict? All of this metadata aims to answer the kind of journalistic 5 Ws and 1 H of data. So who created the data? what does the data file contain, when were the data created, where were the data created, why were the data created, and how were the data created. So we have lots of examples of how this is done. Overall, the key question is, what would someone with no prior knowledge of the project or data need in order to be able to understand or use that data correctly in their own research? Some of the metadata that we capture on the UKDS catalog pages includes these fields. So we have an abstract, we have a set of keywords and topics, which in our catalog are based on standardized schema. So you can search and select from a list of keywords and topics, dates of field work, the country that the research was conducted in. There's information about the sample, including, observation or analytic units, who the population is, the number that's actually in the sample. And there's also information collected about the method and the kind of data and weighting where that's applicable. But if we're collecting this information, we might possibly tacitly use and pull on this information in our own research. Why have you said it needs to be structured in a particular way? Structured metadata is metadata that's standardized, and it uses a schema to guide those descriptions. By using structured metadata, it helps us establish how one piece of information relates to other pieces of information and makes it easier for computers to automatically extract information from the metadata. This is obviously helpful for archives who are looking to increase findability of data collections, but it's also useful for researchers as a comparative to see how your research fits in with the larger field. It helps you find background literature or data to build up the context for your own research questions. And this information provides context that might influence the decisions that you make in an analysis. So what are metadata standards and who decides these? A metadata standard provides a framework to establish a common set of characteristics or attributes of data. These are very standardized from the language and the spelling and the format. All of that is taken into account when setting those standards. If everyone uses a different standard, it makes it very difficult to find or compare data from different sources. A metadata standard is a requirement which is intended to establish a common understanding of the meaning and the semantics of that data. And it ensures a correct and proper use and interpretation of the data by the owners and the reusers. But there are different standards that are set based on disciplinary differences. So consequently, sometimes it's necessary for a translation program to map between these standards to allow for better findability. So metadata standards allow for data discovery and access, for consequent reuse of the data, interoperability of different systems. So being able to use data across different systems and programs, and sharing of data and metadata between communities, be those communities, data providers like archives or data users and different types of data users. There are a number of metadata schemas that can be used. However, for those who are doing research in the social sciences, DDI is a schema to understand best, and it's also what the UK Data Service uses to underpin our data catalog. So DDI, or the Data Documentation Initiative, is rich and detailed metadata standard, which has been developed by the DDI Alliance. There's a couple of different versions of DDI. So there's DDI Codebook and DDI Lifecycle. So DDI Codebook gathers more kind of basic information, and it's often used to describe collections at a higher level. So it's really useful for data catalogs. DDI lifecycle, on the other hand, is a little bit more complex. It allows you to describe, for example, survey questions and variables, in addition to also the basic catalog information. DDI life cycle might be particularly useful if you're looking at things like longitudinal studies, where similar questions or variables might be reused across different survey waves. It allows for you to be able to identify and compare responses of some of those same variables. So just to point out, there's a lot of different types of metadata standards and schemas. Some have very, very specific uses. You can use more than one standard to help you describe data, and you may be able to map or translate across different standards. If you are planning to archive data, you will need to provide some metadata to describe it. And this is usually gathered by a form where you add information about your data and its provenance. And behind that form, the information is categorized into metadata elements that are going to construct the catalog record for your data. So for the UK Data Service catalog, these are DDI metadata elements. At the UK Data Service, our DDI records contain mandatory and optional metadata elements on the following areas. And just a second ago, I'll scroll through it again. Oh, maybe it won't. There we go. This is our catalog page. So you'll see every catalog page has the following areas. You've got a study description. So this is information about the context of the data collection. So that's things like bibliographic citation of the study, the scope of the study. So this is the topics and the geography and the time. The methodology of data collection. There's information about sampling and processing, data access information, and information on accompanying materials as well. There's also data file descriptions. So this is information about the data format, the file type, the file structure, if there's missing data, if there's weighting of variables, if there's particular software that's used. You'll also have variable descriptions, and then there's keywords. So it's good practice to use a thesaurus like the European Language Social Science thesaurus. This is the multilingual thesaurus for social sciences. It's worth considering how to describe and share your metadata as openly as possible. Using the FAIR principles can help with that, and other tools such as metadata profiles. Those can all kind of help you decide what are the important metadata elements to include when describing your study. Okay, so in addition to the DDI structure of the metadata for our catalog pages, we also have these controlled vocabularies. So you'll notice on the catalog pages, we also have a section called topics and a section called keywords that you can use to search for related data. These aren't just free text fields. These are from controlled vocabularies. So the UK Data Archive is guardian of the Humanities and Social Science Electronic Thesaurus, and its multilingual version, the European Language Social Science Thesaurus. There are a number of these vocabularies, which are usually very discipline specific again. So this next exercise we're going to do is going to give you a bit of an opportunity to search through different controlled vocabulary. So for this exercise, if you go to Bartok, so that's bartok.org, you can use the search bar in the center just to start searching for controlled vocabularies for your discipline. So let's say your background is sociology. If you just type in sociology, it will come up with examples of controlled vocabularies. And you can kind of search through those. You can compare it as well if you want to do some more searching, try psychology or something like that, and see what else will come up. It'll just give you a kind of taste for the different vocabularies that are used to describe those particular disciplines. So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to find the website and have a couple of searches to see what kind of results you get, and we'll move on from there. Just going to check in on the Q&A and the chat to see if there's anything questions so far. So we'll move on. Do feel free to keep having a search through Bartok if you'd like to. But I'm going to move on to the data level documentation. Here, I'm going to look at what is data level documentation and what are some of the key considerations for survey types, so quantitative type of data, numerical data, and key considerations for qualitative data. So data level documentation is about, the specific data files that are within your collection. So this relates to the whole, not the whole collection, but a very specific data file within that collection, which could be, for example, a single interview transcript, or it could be an SPSS file, or it could be a single image associated with your particular research collection. So often this kind of metadata is embedded within the file, and sometimes you collect this information as a standard part of your data collection. So in survey data, data level documentation tends to be very structured. And if you're using a program like SPSS, the software is designed for you to add this metadata before you even begin your analysis. So this metadata then becomes embedded within the data. For variable names, there needs to be, for example, a question number system, which matches the questions in the questionnaire. Or if there's a numerical system used, it should be clear what system is used and how it relates to the questionnaire, or the variable names that are used. We should have meaningful abbreviations, such as, GOR for government office region. There should be some consistency in naming conventions across the entire project, especially where there are different data sets across the project. And finally, for interoperability across platforms, variables should not be longer than 8 characters, and they should not have spaces. Following the similar principles for variable names, the variable labels should be brief and concise, no more than 80 characters. Where it's applicable, they should use a unit of measurement. Again, if it's applicable, describe the coding and the classification scheme that's used, including a reference. So for example, the Standard Occupation Classification 2000, so SOC 2000, would be used if that fits. Finally, include a reference to the question in the survey or the questionnaire. The example here does all of that. So we have, at the bottom there, Q9BHEXW. So this is given the label Q9B hours spent taking physical exercise in a typical week. So the label here clearly includes the unit of measurement and a reference to the question. So not only does this make it easier for reusers, but I expect it would probably also make it much easier for you during the analysis as well. And you should add value labels as well, so making sure there's no out of bounds values for categorical variables, avoid having blanks or zeros, and instead label your missing data with detail where possible. So differentiating between things like, for example, not recorded, not provided, not applicable, not known, etc. So here's an example of an SPSS variable view, which shows the variable name. You can see the label here as well as the measurement, and you can see the missing values as well. And here's the variable values. And again, this includes missing information. With transcripts, data level documentation is usually included at the start of each interview. So for those that are curated by the UK Data Archive, you'll see this kind of information at the start of each interview. So there'll be the name of the collection, the principal investigator, and some demographic details about the participants. So for example, we often have details like the sex of the participant, the socioeconomic status, and the region that's associated with them. So these details can vary depending on what characteristics are deemed important or influential in the study. So if perhaps class wasn't deemed as particularly important, but age was, you might see a little bit of variation there. Images similarly will have some metadata about the image itself. So I should say we don't have many collections with images. There are some lingering issues around anonymization of images. And that impacts us being able to, take in the image as is. So when you start having to treat it and anonymize it, you begin to question the usefulness of that image. So we're still kind of working through some of those issues. However, we do have some images, including images with our Edwardians collection, which is the metadata that you're looking at. So that in those collections, we usually include a caption, which describes the photo itself, including anything that might be notable about the image. You might also include some historical notes that would help contextualize that image. You can also record characteristics like the region or the year that it was taken or who it was taken by. All of that would be useful metadata to help make sense of those images at a later date. Okay, so that's your data level documentation. Fairly straightforward, I think. We're going to look at study level documentation now. So I'll give you a bit of an overview of what study level documentation is. And again, some considerations for survey data and qualitative data. So user guides are the key piece of documentation that we would put together that sit alongside data collections. And those user guides include further information about the methods and the field work. It includes all this information together in a single file, and that would be something that's normally available openly. So you don't need to register in order to view that documentation. Looking at the user guide alone, you would probably be able to start unpicking some of the intricacies of the collection. So rather than being embedded in the data, like data level documentation often is, user guides would be a separate document entirely. And user guides do look different across the different collections that we hold. There's no specific template as such, but rather it's something that's tailored to what information is available and what the specifics are of that collection. So I'm not going to go into the specific user guides for these collections here, but these slides are going to be available after the event on our web pages. So feel free to have a look at those. Click on the links, the DOIs, to have a look through some of those user guides. I have included 3 of them here that are quite different from each other. Within the collections that are curated by the UK Data Archive, all of the different kind of research materials that you collect in the background would be collated into a single user guide. So the user guide is then bookmarked, and you can see here in the on the right side of the screenshot, you've got some bookmarks that tell you what materials are available, and they tend to encompass the project level documentation. So while the collections curated by UK Data Archive have user guides, what you're more likely to see in some of our reshare collections or ones where people have used our self-deposit system is that there will be a folder of documents or separate files that are deposited by the researchers themselves. So there's a couple of different ways basically of including that kind of documentation. This user guide is an example of a user guide from a survey. So you can see the bookmarks of the information provided with this user guide, and it basically acts as a map to kind of talk you through the preparation and delivery of the survey, as well as any other information that you might need to know. So here's further information about, the sample, there's the questionnaire, the data structure. There's even a how to cite the user guide section on this one. In addition to what you saw in that example, other key documentation for surveys include things like technical reports. There might be information leaflets and protocols. There might be blank questionnaires with code books and survey instructions. Coding frames. I've seen some where they've taken the questionnaire and actually written in on the blank kind of questionnaire, their coding scheme that they used, and any other information about known errors or issues with the data that would all get included with survey data. Qualitative collections also have user guides, like the one that you see pictured here, and this time the bookmarks are on the left-hand side. This one shows that there's an interview topic guide along with the final report that was done for the project as a whole. There's also a blank consent form and more information about the sample. Here's some examples of documentation for qualitative work. Basically, this is all the information that you probably create along the way of doing research, but which is never seen outside of the research team and maybe the participants. So it can include interview preparation, including instructions to interviewers or prompts or topic guides that were used during the interview. Could have blank consent forms and information sheets or any other materials that the participant received prior to taking part. It could also be text that was written by the researcher, expanding on the methodology or the sampling, including where it's permissible under copyright, extracts of publications, or perhaps draft work of something that was published. What we don't see often, but can also be really useful, is things like research meeting minutes or research diaries or field notes, and documentation from analysis, including memos and code books and initial analysis write-ups. We have about over 1,500 collections of qualitative research, and we don't often see things on analysis. I'm not sure why it's not part of like the kind of standard documentation that you would see, because this is something that's pretty standard in quantitative collections. So quantitative collections would include the code or the syntax. But that kind of analytic transparency can really help to validate the research findings and can help reusers better understand some of the decisions that were made or not made about the cleaning and processing of the data. And this kind of context is actually really, really important to qualitative work. This is part of what the argument is for doing things qualitatively, that you better understand the context. So hopefully those materials are being actively considered by the research team during their data collection and analysis, but we don't often see them in the collections that we offer. Collating them and making them available as documentation would really help achieve what I think qualitative work is trying to achieve. So we can take it, is the moral of the story there. So rather than being collated as a single document under the user guide, as with the survey examples, sometimes that documentation remains separated into different documents. So you can see this is a mixed methods study that was done with focus groups and a survey, and you can see all of the documentation is included there, but it's all included as separate files rather than a collated user guide. And it doesn't mean that the documentation is better or worse than any other. It's just when we collate it with the UK Data Service, we put it all into one user guide. When researchers are depositing it themselves, you will often see it as separate documents. As an alternative to embedded metadata, you can also have information in a kind of structured document altogether, like code books and data dictionaries. This should contain detailed and sufficient information about all the data items. So that includes variables that are, both new and derived. Frequencies might have command files that were used to create some of the derived variables. We also have codebook creation tools. So we use the DDI editor, which is aimed at data processing for curation purposes. So this can be used prior to depositing your collection in the archive. We also have the NestStar publisher. There's a lot of existing information on these and how they can be used. So please do check the links there for further information on these. And just having a little bit of a closer look at the code books. So you can see this one is from Understanding Society, teaching data set, and you can see the variable name, the label, and options for responses and the range of responses. So unlike embedded metadata that was shown earlier, this code book can sit separately from the data, and it can also be open. So there's no actual data recorded, like responses, I should say, from participants that is recorded here. So this is documentation that would sit openly, so anybody who's interested in the data collection would be able to look at this documentation and see what sorts of things were asked and how were they asked. Data dictionaries are very similar to code books, and often those terms are used interchangeably. And they also sit within the study level documentation. So often the data dictionary will contain a little bit more information about the structure of the database. So you can see here they've documented the variable is numeric and scale level measurements. In addition to the user guide, the UK Data Archive also curates what's called a data list, which is this at a glance look at participants. So this would probably be considered, well, you could consider it data level documentation because you have each file down that last column, and this is information about each of them. So you get a lot of information about a single data file, but at the same time, this is an at-a-glance look at the project as a whole, at all of the participants. So this is just basic metadata, basic demographic details about each participant and which file name correlates to that individual. So the details on these data lists aren't necessarily standardized or all-encompassing. It's the details that were relevant to the project itself. Sometimes if you are trying to assemble one for your own collection, they can take a little bit of time to assemble, but they are also really useful organizational tools during research. So it's generally a good practice to try and keep a data list going, create one as you go along. Other types of documentation include things like observations that were written by researchers in the moment of data gathering. Some types of methods dictate time for self-reflection as part of the method, and this might even be used as data itself, so there's a little bit of a gray area between data and documentation. Others just say, this is a good practice. This helps give a little bit more context to whatever the actual data is. So the comments here from a collection called Affluent Worker, they're just a few sentences each, and they were written after every, it was a face-to-face survey that was done with this kind of semi-structured interview in the middle of it. So it's a mixed methods project. And those comments are written after every interview was done by the interviewers for the affluent worker. And that research actually went on eventually to underpin the ONS categories for class today. So it's quite a seminal piece of research. But these sentences help to contextualize the relationships between the researcher and the participant. And they are really helpful pieces of kind of this data level / project level documentation. It is a little bit unusual to see these. I'm not sure if the methods that are often used just don't dictate this kind of quick reflection, or if it's just not something that's often shared, but it really helps to rebuild some of the power dynamics of the interview. I suppose as well, a lot of the surveys that are done now are kind of done as kind of self-reported, individual, quite, often done remotely at the participant's leisure, that sort of thing, whereas this was conducted face-to-face. A step further than those comments would be field notes and draft work of the analyses. So this is an example of Dennis Marsden's Mothers Alone collection. And he wrote this piece called Felt Poverty, which never made it to any of his publications, but it was included in the documentation for this collection. And it's a really interesting collection. So this was led by, white educated men who were interviewing single mothers living on welfare. So there's not a lot of overlap between the researchers and the participants. But this piece that he wrote, I think, really provides the context to show the sympathy that the research team felt toward their participants, and kind of gives you a little bit of a glimpse into what the interactions might have been like. Annette Lawson did a mixed methods study called Adultery, an Analysis of Love and Betrayal. And this was a project that was conducted in the 1980s, and it was aiming to explore an extremely taboo topic, at the time anyways, of adultery. So not something people would normally talk about. So it was actually really hard for her to recruit participants. So Lawson chose to put out a call for participants in a newspaper. and it created this arguably biased sample. So it was mostly white, mostly middle class women who responded to her call for participants. And as such, Lawson became a bit preoccupied with the sample, and she wrote a 54-page defense of her sample. And she starts here with this discussion on a couple of ethical conundrums that arose from her sampling strategy. And this included jealous partners who were sending in information of their married partners to participate. And there was another man who called in from a psychiatric ward. And then she had this extensive comparison between her sample and the national population. And she was exploring what were the significant differences between her sample and the national population. And of those variables, which ones would actually impact her findings. And then at the end, she comes to these very interesting conclusions about sampling strategies more broadly, including the point that sampling needs to match the context of the study, and that exploratory studies are benefited from a greater focus on the ability to talk about the topic in detail rather than a focus on who the participants were. So it was quite a lengthy kind of thing to write, and it just got included with her documentation. Again, it didn't, if you read any of the other publications that arose from this study, you get this really sanitized kind of paragraph about the methods. But this documentation she provided really went into much more detail. Earlier, I had some examples of interviewer notes, but field notes is another example of very detailed documentation. So field notes, like some of the, or perhaps a little bit more even than the interviewer comments, they occupy this gray area between being both data and documentation at different times. And it's worth pointing out that documentation is something that normally is openly available. So you don't need to register in order to view it. There's no worries of disclosure from the information that's provided. So field notes can sometimes sit openly like that, depending on the reflections and the level of detail that's in there. Sometimes they may need to be put under similar access restrictions as the data itself. Of the qualitative projects that we have, there's only about half a dozen collections with examples of field notes, so there's not many at all. And of those, almost all of them are ethnographic. So the level of detail that's provided with the data on those is quite exemplary, I would say. There are also new possibilities with changing technology. So a lot of the software that is used to analyze data has more options for the kind of documentation that you can create alongside the data. If we look specifically at qualitative software, and Vivo and other computer-assisted qualitative analysis software allows you to, for example, download your code books, to download memos, to download mind maps as well. And you can see a list here of nodes, as they call them, and their descriptions. All of this is very easily downloadable. When we received the Edwardians collections, for example, which were interviews that were done with 453 participants who were born during the Edwardian period. So this collection was done in the 70s. I think the longest interview in there was something like 80 plus pages. So it was really important to have a little bit of documentation to kind of sit alongside some of this because nobody has the time to read all of those interviews to understand the collection as a whole. But it was accompanied by all of the work that was done by hand. So we had 16 shelves that were dedicated to holding the coding of those transcripts into key themes. So they had printed out all of the interview transcripts onto this, what's called onion skin paper. And they went through and they would cut out data segments and code them and put them into these folders based on the codes and then arrange those into themes. So we had 16 shelves of those bits of data basically with the larger coding. Now all of this can be downloaded in a single file, and it can be done at any point after the coding, and it doesn't necessarily have to hold the data itself. You can have the code name with a description of it. So there's a lot more possibilities now with some of these analysis programs. Research teams can also use blogs and websites to keep in touch with participants or to keep a research diary, which updates others on the progress of the research. It may post information for participants, might even send out calls for participants. Once a project is done, that site can sit alongside the data collection as a related resource, providing that kind of additional documentation. We do also see some more creative documentation too, such as the photo story. Again, this sort of thing might be classed as documentation or potentially data, but there is scope to use video and audio files to accompany data. So we have done recordings of researchers who talk about the research, talk through the methodology, or who might have like a question and answer sort of thing about the collection. Finally, changing technology is not just for how research is done, but also how we archive. So the UK Data Service has created a platform called QualiBank, which is an online tool for searching, browsing, and citing qualitative data. So as part of this tool, you can search and view qualitative data online and also view the linked documentation. That documentation can relate to the specific data item or the collection as a whole, but it allows that distinction between the project level and the data level documentation. Conversely, our data catalog focuses on the project level documentation. It will have data level documentation either embedded within the data files, or it might have it as a kind of listed under its documentation. It might have one of those kind of at a glance look like the data listings. And finally, in addition to all of those related resources, we also have the README file. And this file usually contains information about how the data was prepared for ingest into the archive. Within the archive, this file can be automatically generated and then edited as needed, but it's really important that you write a README file that kind of sits alongside your data and just kind of, details what the processes were to clean up the data, what any problems there might be or missing data, that sort of thing, anything of note. So just as a kind of some final concluding remarks here, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some projects that have looked at reusing documentation and also a data sharing checklist. So some mandatory documentation that we require if you're going to deposit with us. So final points that I want to make about reusing documentation. Often we think about the reuse value of data specifically, but less about how documentation has its own value. So documentation can serve as an inspiration for good practices. So you can adapt existing consent forms and information sheets rather than writing them from scratch. We have literally hundreds of consent forms that are documented within our collections, including snippets of the ones that you see here, which explain, what data sharing means. So feel free to explore those pieces of documentation and learn about some of the good research practices from that. You can also do the same with data collections. So one collection on the foot and mouth disease in North Cumbria deposited their interview guides, which were then reused by med students to better understand doctor and patient dynamics. I also refer some of my dissertation students to find similar interview guides on their particular topic that they're researching before setting out and making one themselves, because I think it can be really helpful to see what's important to ask, what's not, and how those kinds of questions might be phrased. You can also examine how to do research with children and other vulnerable groups. So writing up information letters and consent forms when you're doing research with children or vulnerable groups can be especially difficult. We sometimes misjudge the language and the level of reading, but we do have some collections which provide pretty good examples, I think, of how this was done in the past. And you can always look at that as a template and kind of amend it for your own projects going forward. We do also have a data sharing checklist, so this is mandatory documentation. So when you go to deposit data with us, we're going to ask for very specific documentation files depending on what you're sharing. So there might be already some templates that are available that you can just download and adapt to your project. So for example, if you're depositing a qualitative project with us, we would expect some user guide, so some kind of information about the context of the study. We would expect a data listing and a README file. So the data listing and the README file both have templates that you can use and adapt for your own projects. If you're looking at depositing numerical data with us, so this is quantitative studies and it's something like a survey, we would be looking for something like a data dictionary or a code book, as well as a README file. And then any other information that might be used for a user guide. What you would do when you go to deposit with us then is fill in a data offer that's done online through your account, and you try and fill in that deposit form with as much detail as possible because that metadata that you're filling in when you fill in that data offer form is what is going to feed into our data catalog. So that is the metadata that it's capturing. You'd also want to ensure that your data files contain data level documentation. So again, looking at those SPSS files, if you've made those, making sure that they've got the right kind of documentation embedded within them. Interview transcripts or other qualitative data, again, that they have that embedded metadata with them. We also have lots of tools and templates that you can use and adapt for your own research. So if you're looking to create some of this documentation as you're doing your research, because you see how helpful it can be for the research process itself, feel free to have a look at our model consent form and our survey consent statement. We also have transcription templates, transcription instructions, confidentiality agreements, and data listing templates. All of those can be downloaded and adapted for your own project, so you don't have to invent the wheel. You just can download it from us and then start recording that documentation as you do your research. We do also have some further resources if you're interested. So we have a learning hub, which details a little bit more about data management. The CESDA, so this is the Consortium for European Social Science Data Archives, also has some data management expert guidance that is out. The UK Data Service has also published its own kind of textbook, Managing and Sharing Data, Best Practices for Researchers. Closer also have a learning hub. And then, of course, if you're interested in the FAIR principles, you can go to gofair.org to learn a little bit more about those. So this is an image of our managing and sharing research data. And we also offer lots of other training. So I'm doing another session next week on anonymization. So do check our training events and our text. Okay, if you do want to drop into any of the upcoming workshops, you can find those on the events page and register for them there, just like you would have done for this workshop. And we're also on social media, so feel free to get in touch with us. You can join our JISC list or check out our YouTube channel as well. That is it from me, kind of a whiz through our different documentation. So we do have some time if people have questions. So feel free to pop some questions in. I know there's a lot of new vocabulary here. So when I talk about things like DDI and structured metadata or controlled vocabularies and using, our thesaurus for your controlled vocabulary, some of that I think can be a lot of new information at once. So if you have any questions, do let me know, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of insight into the kind of documentation you might be gathering and how it might be used across the research cycle, as well as when you share data with us. That is everything. If as you go away from the workshop, if you do have questions that come up later, feel free to pop me an email. I'm happy to follow up if you have any more questions that come to you later. If not, I think that is the end of this webinar. Thank you all for taking the time to come. There is an evaluation survey when you leave, so if you do have a few minutes and are able to answer that, that would be really helpful for us. We do look at all of the answers. We do amend our content based on the feedback that we get. And of course, if you suggest anything, we do our best to see if there's somebody who could deliver that kind of training. So we do read all of the feedback very closely, and we do appreciate any time that you take in giving us that. Thank you all and have a wonderful week. What a great way to start out your week on Monday with metadata. So hopefully the week just gets easier from here. And see you maybe at some of the next training. Thank you all.